Chapter 5, The Journey Story, continues. The Rise of Persecution and Babalola's Imprisonment. The revival entered its second phase in March 1931. A new attitude emerged from the colonial government. The resident of Oyo province, who had set his face against new conception of religion, not under the control of responsible authorities, had sent circulars to all his DO to take steps to stamp out the movement. Thus, the colonial officers, the traditional institution, and the mission church, which had been sympathetic to the revival, in its early days began to openly work against the revival. The moment it became clear to the mission church that the Aladuras too were planning of establishing a separate church, they ceased to cooperate with the revival and began to openly magnify some of the critical shortcomings of the revival and to urge the colonial officials to proscribe the movement. This became the beginning of troubles for the Aladura and especially the revivalists, who were summoned several times before district officers, tried in the open court, detained and harassed by the government. This persecution also took the form of denial, as Aladuras were denied land grants to erect places of worship, and where properties were granted, they were usually in remote places or rejected territory and forbidden forests, where spirits and corpses of wicked people were usually buried. Their children were denied admissions into mission schools, and those already there were expelled. The worst, however, was the attack on the Aladura leaders which followed. Thus, in April 1932, Babalola was arrested and tried in Benin for, supposedly, participating in witch-testing ordeals and sentenced to 6-month imprisonment in Benin prison. In another work, I have shown with detailed archival sources and considerable textual attestations that the charge against Babalola, his trial and conviction, were pre-planned, stage-managed, false and fraudulent, and a manipulation by the colonial government to strike at the big man of the movement, and probably to prepare the Aladura movement for a foreign takeover. In the meantime, Babalola continued the revival in the prison, which led to the conversion of some who, on their release, would take the apostolic vision to Calabar and Creek Town and lay the foundation of apostolic work in the Midwest and the East. It was this persecution which forced the movement to enter into a partnership or collaboration with the Apostolic Church of Pennygrows in September of 1931, which prompted the church to send 2 resident missionaries later, while Babalola was still in prison in June 1932. Idris Vaughn, one of the 2 missionaries, later admitted in his book based on the confession of the resident officer to him that Babalola really did not commit any crime, but he had to be removed from the scene as a tactical measure of bringing the whole unrest to an end. The cooperation between the revival movement and the Apostolic Church of Pennygrows did not, however, hold for long, and within a decade, there was a split leading to the separation, which has resulted in the formation of 2 apostolic churches, Christ Apostolic Church and the Apostolic Church. Babalola, Akinyele, and Odubanjo, with most of the original leaders of the revival, would form the nucleus of what would later become CAC as General Evangelist, President, and General Superintendent, respectively. Marriage and family life in 1935. Babalola took the major step towards holy matrimony. He was only 31. The lucky lady was no other person than Dorcas Adatun, a native of Lisha, the town where Babalola first made his nationwide fame and renown. The wedding was solemnized at Efon Alaye by the European missionary of the Apostolic Church, Pastor George Perfect, according to S. A. Sadella, who witnessed it. He was assisted by Pastor Odubanjo, Odusona, and Medayese. This marriage was blessed, with 5 children, namely Abiye, Wura, Tunji, Apeke. However, the male children did not survive as they both died in their infancy. Only 3 children outlived Babalola from this marriage. Abiye, Mrs. Babalola, Wura, Mrs. Ogini, and Apeke, Mrs. Adeniyi. Of these 3, only the last 2 are still living as at this writing. This marriage was stormy based on the accounts, of several witnesses who knew and or lived with the couple and who were interviewed by this author, including Babalola's younger sister, Mrs. Olanrewaju. This was, however, due to the enormous pressure brought on the home as a result of the challenge of the work on Babalola's time, which forced him to be away from home most of the time, and not due to the character of the woman, as has been falsely chronicled through side talks, tales, and comment over the years. Obviously, even the best and the most saintly of women would not endure certain things. He himself admitted in a written document that he had a good wife, and he should know. His extended family, however, presents a very interesting study. Babalola was the only son of his mother, but he had 5 younger sisters who all married ministers of God, except one. Mrs. Ajibola was married to Pastor Ajibola. Mrs. Orogun was married to Pastor Orogun, who became CAC 4th president. Mrs. Adedipe was the wife of Pastor Adedipe, once the principal of CAC Seminary. The remaining 2 sisters were twins. Mrs. Taiwo Olowolagba was the wife of Pastor Olujobi Olowolagba of Efon Alaye, and Mrs. Kehinde Olanrewaju was the wife of Elder Olanrewaju of Gospel Apostolic Church, the only one who did not marry a pastor and whose husband was not from CAC Apa. David Rotimi himself lived to old age. He lived with his wife Mama Rotimi at Ayo Ekiti, very near to the son who was based at Efon. This great man, a pioneer of faith, died with a solid Christian testimony in 1939 on a glorious note. On the day of his death, a crowd of ministers had gathered around him, including his son, Joseph Babalola, and his son-in-law, Orogun. Orogun had asked him whether he had accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior, and he responded that Jesus had been with him that day, and they'd conversed together. That Jesus told him he was going to the east, and him, Rotimi, should get ready because on his return journey he would be coming by 12 noon that day to take him to his eternal rest. At 11:55, he signaled to the crowd around his bed that he could see Jesus coming, and everyone began to pray to make request from him. At exactly 12 noon, this noble man, this patriarch of faith, slept quietly in a glorious way. He was buried at Efon Alaye, owing to some scheming. 20 years later, in 1959, Babalola too would ascend in pursuit of the same Jesus that took his father away. Indeed, as Solomon noted more than 3,000 years ago, the righteous is an everlasting foundation. Hitherto, we have considered the life of Babalola, especially his roots and calling. We have seen that he was a human being born of a woman with a father and sisters. He was a real personality with human dimensions. But as with most special vessels of the Almighty, he also had a superhuman dimension, a mystical element that we must not ignore. To do so would mean losing a vital part of his story. And here let me sound a note of warning, because there are certain aspects of Babalola's story that are difficult to believe even in spite of several attestations by men of honest intentions and report. The essential Joseph Babalola. Who was Joseph Ayo Babalola? This question is important because any attempt at understanding a man's work or movement must begin first with the accurate interpretation of the man himself. Any attempt to construct or reconstruct his story must first begin with an accurate interpretation of the man himself. As E.M. Bounds has noted, the messenger must come before the message, and the messenger must be greater than the message. So who was Joseph Babalola? We shall attempt to see the man from the natural, social, and spiritual dimensions as remembered by some of those closest to him, children, sisters, associates, neighbors, etc. Joseph Babalola was a dark-skinned, tall, and muscular man with a heavily built human frame and tribal marks. A slow-speaking introvert with a gentle but cheerful countenance and tender eyes, his common outfit consisted of a cassock, usually white or brown, an iron staff, the Bible, and a handbell. Later in life, he did not carry the iron staff again because its purposed dominion over forces of evil had been achieved. He had a powerful carriage and a compelling presence, and when he appeared on the stage, you knew he was there. When you meet him, said the younger sister, you have to honor him whether you are Muslim or Christian or heathen. He had a personality that commanded respect. A British missionary who met him in 1932 for the first time described his impression in these words. My first impression of Joseph as we met with him at Benin was that of a sturdy young man of about 5'10", of open countenance and of easy, gentle disposition. On the social plane, he was a simple man, very easy to live with. Everyone who has volunteered to speak has noted his humility and simplicity. Everyone was important in his scheme, and he valued and gave honor to everybody. He would not answer anyone hastily, and he would not give more attention to the rich than the poor. In fact, a journalist observed during the Oki-Ui revival that when both the poor and the rich needed him, he answered the poor first. Money or materialism meant nothing to him, unlike the modern-day pastors. He had very few material things. His clothing were few because, according to the daughter, he believed in giving away rather than keeping for himself. A woman who went to Ifan to teach in 1943 told me she was shocked when she entered Babalola's house and could not find any of the evidence that usually meets you on entering a rich or great man's house. Only the bare necessities. He had no luxury whatsoever. There was no evidence that this was a great man's house, despite his popularity. It was completely out of proportion with his status. This ascetic lifestyle was the reason for his rigorous self-denial and renunciation. He saw this world as temporary, fading and unstable hence, like most great saints of Christian history. He shunned the world and materialism with a firm but cheerful disregard. He was also very generous to a fault. He financed the wedding of many people, including pastors, and sponsored many children who had no father. At his death in 1959, there were 50 of such children, and another arrangement had to be made for them. He loved children in particular, and several children lived in his own house with his children whose responsibility he took up. He bought sewing machines for several, women whose husbands were too poor to do so. He was too compassionate to turn away from human needs and social deprivations. Prophet Ayo Babalola, who took over from Babalola after his death, said that Babalola was a true lamb of Jesus Christ. He was gentle and patient with everybody. He would not hurry anyone out of his presence. He would not turn anyone away. Said the daughter, Mrs. Adeniyi, our house was the house of everybody, no privacy. Even when Baba was eating, people would kneel and ask for his prayers, which he willingly did. Even when he was in the bathroom bathing, another pastor who lived with him told me people would kneel outside asking for counsels or prayers, and he would oblige them. It was that bad. But for Babalola, the true Lamb of Jesus, it was okay by him. He had no privacy, and people both old and young readily impinged on his personal space. Sometimes his breakfast would be ready on the table, but he would not be chanced to eat it, even for the few days when he was not fasting. His whole life was one complete profile in self-denial for the good of others. This was why he spent considerable time on the mountains, where he could have personal time with his Maker. He also entered the social world and dimension of the people by showing interest in their work and social affairs. He taught farmers to tithe and give to God the first fruits of their harvests, and to remember the poor, widows, and the fatherless in accordance with the Mosaic order, so that God could bless them with good harvest and rainfall at the right season. He taught the people the principles of hygiene and instructed them how to institute sanitary principles around their domain and how to dispose wastes long before any activism on the environment. He told his people to build goodly houses made of blocks and burnt bricks instead of mud so as to endure for generations. He taught Ifan people to pay their taxes faithfully and promptly, thereby ensuring better social relations between the government and the governed. In his days, Ifon had the highest tax compliance in the whole of Ekiti division, according to colonial government records. He discouraged going into debt especially for the sake of marriage, and he simplified wedding procedures and purged it of its heavy financial concomitants and other later money-guzzling accretions so that all you needed to be wedded was only a new Bible for the charge. He wedded people who had reached marriageable age for free, thereby releasing a generation of men and women from financial yoke that God did not put on their necks, a yoke that has now returned 7 times worse in the modern church of the present day. He also discouraged litigation, but taught people to leave their grievances in the hands of God, the righteous judge, and to forgive their fellow men. On the spiritual plane, he was an able minister of the New Testament. He read the Bible and devoured it like a hungry man. He was familiar with scriptures and taught his ministers the need for spending time with the Word. He knew and could quote the whole Psalms offhand because he had read it more than 50 times over. He was a powerful preacher, and he could preach up a storm. He usually dwelt on specifics rather than generalities in his preaching. He would fearlessly denounce the common evils of his day, such as secret societies, use of charms, medicines, and sorcery, while also emphasizing the virtues of honesty, hard work, holiness, and righteousness. For this reason, he encouraged the Christians of his day to use the period of Lent every year as seasons of spiritual renewal, restitution, and reconciliation with the Almighty. He spent so much time in prayer, and when he prayed, it was like a powerful generator working. A study of Babalola's life and journey shows the mystical element, to the point that the facts and realities of his life are as presented and true to that very point. We may place him among the mystics. The facts and experiences of his life, his several revelations and out-of-body experiences are the proofs which establish his claim to be mystic. In this state, he was given to know about mysteries regarding the creation of the world, why children stay 9 months in the womb, what takes place during conception, marriage, choice of a partner, etc. Going through his records, we see several instances of deep communication with spiritual forces and invisible agents, and a source of knowledge other than the physical, but rooted in the visionary elements. An example of his revelation on marriage is stated, "Was praying in my house very early one day at 5:30 a.m. in the morning. The Lord sent a messenger to answer my prayer. I was told to be quiet and patient to see a vision from God and to understand the matter thoroughly. This was how the messenger took me in a vision to a big farm where there were many calabashes. The Lord then asked me, 'What are these?' 'Calabashes,' I replied. The Lord then began to explain to me that this world is a farm and human beings are like the seeds planted therein, and that when God, created man, it was like the calabash sown in the farm, which is never different with its cover, but one and the same thing. Before a calabash can be useful, it must be processed into 2, consisting the cover and the main calabash, and a calabash has only 1 cover and not 2. And likewise, a cover has only 1 calabash, not 2, and another cover will not fit into any main calabash even if they are processed from the same root. He was given the meaning of this, which is that the man is the main calabash and the woman is the cover. A man cannot be satisfied without a woman, and likewise a woman cannot be satisfied without a man. And just as 1 calabash cannot have more than 1 cover, so also God has ordained 1 man for 1 woman. In another time he was given to know why there were more women than men. The Lord revealed it to me to see this. I was taken to a big house, where there were many calabash covers without the main calabashes. I was then asked the meaning of this. 'I do not know,' I answered. The Lord then told me that these are the women that have had no husbands, and many whose husbands have died, because when Satan saw that he failed and wanted to trap humanity at all costs, he did this by causing nations to engage in war and be killing themselves. Then the women would be spared, some virgins, some widows. Therefore, women are not really more than men. Secondly, the Lord also explained it to me like this. 15 children can be born in a single house, 5 females and 10 males. However, the male children can all die before they know or join the Lord through the activities of the wicked people and Satan, but the females will all survive. Then in the future, these will also be left without husbands. Going through his records, diaries and materials reveal several of such communications with the other world. Apart from this, there were on at least 3 occasions when he underwent striking bodily changes and unconsciousness, so that he seemed for days at a time like one dead, and during these periods was more conscious of the other world than the present world. It's time to go. From 1955 upwards, the tone and ministry of Babalola began to change. Even his concerns and approach to things began to take a different turn. He began to relieve himself of certain responsibilities which he had graciously taken, and began to prepare his close associates for the coming eventuality. In the early part of that year, he took his close associates, a coterie of pastors and prophets very close to him, to Ijumu in the present Yagba local government of Kogi State. There, after their prayer and fasting retreat, he told them that they should learn to take full responsibilities for the church, because very soon he would be going on a journey and would not be there to give them directives again. Or he might go and settle in a place for rest, and when he returns, he might not relate with the church, CAC, again. Because these were his beloved, he shared deep secrets with them. He told them that the church has already sewn a garment of shame and getting ready to don the garment, but that it would not happen in his lifetime. Present at this meeting were Andrew Olu Young, J.A. Medeyiz, D.O. Babajidi, etc. At the General Convention of the Church that year, he also enjoined both elders and pastors to be prepared to assert their calling which Christ had given them. Beginning from 1957, however, revelations and warnings began to come from everywhere to CAC to pray, so that a big tree that has branches reaching towards the east, west, south, and north, and whose influence is worldwide, would not fall. But the leadership, and even the common run of the church membership, did not discern. Thus, by 1958, the messages became more direct, specific, and frontal as to the identity of the big tree that was about to fall. In the early morning of July 1958, a young prophet came from Laisha to Ephon Alaye with a direct and specific word from God to the leadership of the CAC Alabukun. The message, according to Olujobi Olowolagba, went like this: Thus saith the Lord, from henceforth don't entangle my servant Joseph Babalola with the affairs of your church. Learn to go on with the administration without him, because the time has come for me to take my servant from your midst. The prophet was a young man, and obviously he did not weigh the consequences of his message before delivering it. At any rate, the leaders, pastors, and elders that he gave the message to were stunned and visibly troubled. They were so discomfited that none of them remembered to give the young man transport money back to his station, as that was the convention in those days, and he was nearly stranded but for the intervention of Pastor Olujobi Olowolagba. Immediately prayers and fasting were declared to stop the evil. But would prayer or fasting change God's design, counsel, and ordination? In the crossover service of 1958-59, there was another sign, this time at Odo Owa, Babalola's hometown. As the prayer for the new year progressed, a young girl, so small that everyone has to keep quiet to even hear her, told of a vision that she saw and warning CAC to pray fervently and vigorously so that a tree whose branches extend to the south, north, east, and west, and whose shade provides comforts to the people of the whole world would not fall. Again, people began to pray with tears. But as the singer sang, "What will be, will definitely be." Why? Because it was time to go. In this same year, Babalola held a powerful crusade in Laisha, the town where his ministry began and took his worldwide acceleration 28 years earlier. He called it Isoji Alasepe, the revival of completion or perfection, It was his own way of bidding farewell to the people and especially to the earth, a witness to the earth and the cosmos that he has completed. What he came to the earth to accomplish. The last day. It was under this shadow of ominous warnings and prophecies that CAC entered 1959. Warnings and dreams were now coming frequently and sporadically as to the effect that a big fish would soon leave the waters. Another little girl, from the countryside in a prayer meeting, told the leaders of a vision she saw in prayer where he saw our father Apostle Babalola bidding the world goodbye. Yet in spite of all these, the leadership did not take note of all these omens and signs. Babalola himself gave a clue to the effect that it was time for all those who were perceptive and discerning enough to know. Usually during the Lent period, he would produce a pamphlet for the prayer and fasting program. He had been doing this since 1945. In the pamphlet of 1959 was this cautionary note. Keep this document for use of several years to come. This was Babalola's warning to the generality of the church of the imminence of his transition. At his Easter sermon that year, he touched on death and the power of death and the triumph of Christ over death. There he told the people that if he should die, they should not begin to think that it was one witch or wizard who did it, because all witches and wizards put together with Satan, their father, could not do it. He encouraged his people to be firm, because he had been to the mountain and has seen the other side. From April, he began to undertake some crucial journeys and travel to different places to strengthen the church. It was that April, 1959, that David Ogunle Odubanjo, the general superintendent of the church, died in Lagos. He was there to preach his funeral and encourage the church to be firm and steadfast. Unknown to the majority of his listeners that he too was preparing and 3 months later would also leave the scene. From June through July, he was virtually on the road from one town to another on account of church affairs. 3 of the places he visited last are, however, worthy of consideration here. In the month of June, on the 16th day, he made an unusual trip to Ayo Ekiti, where his mother, Madam Martha Talabi, lived. Knowing that his time was up and he would leave this world before her, he asked his mother very boldly and pointedly, "If I, Joseph Babalola, your son, should die today, will you desert Jesus?" The answer Babalola got must have pleasantly surprised him from the old woman. "Since my Lord has shown me the way of life, there is no cause for alarm. I know Jesus will take care of me if he takes you away." Then Babalola added this word disguised, in parable, so that the old woman would not get what he was saying. "When Jesus called me in 1928, he did not tell me that he would stay this long before coming back for me. It's now 30 years ago and he has not come. If I did not see him in the next 40 years, I will have to go to heaven to go and call him." The old woman did not discern. But 40 years became 40 days, for exactly 40 days. To the latter, after those conversations were exchanged, Babalola made good his threat to go and meet Jesus. It was after the news of his death reached the mother at Ayo that she cast back her mind and remembered that her son had already forewarned her. He went to Wari in the Delta area around the first week of July. He had to go because the people needed him to confess their sins and ask for his forgiveness. They had been rude to Babalola during the crisis over the separation between the Apostolic Church and Christ Apostolic Church in the late 30s, and had chosen to go with the former even though it was Babalola who founded the church. But problem had started thereafter, and finally God told them that until they reconcile with his servant and got him to pray, they would move from one tragedy to another. This was what brought him to Wari to pray. From there, he went to Lofa and Odo-Owa, his home place, where the church convention was to hold in September that year, to assess their preparations. He was, however, not impressed. In fact, he was greatly saddened by the total unpreparedness of the people, his own people and his next of kin. He had written to them 3 years earlier to tell them to begin to plant cassava, and in 1958 he had written them to tell them to plant yams, because they would be hosting the whole church. But few weeks to the convention there was very little, or nothing on ground. To change the venue was no longer possible because of the imminence. Other towns had hosted the church successfully in the past. How should it be heard that the leader's own town was the place where the thing flopped? This was what pained Babalola, and he spoke to his people that day in the bitterness of his soul. He even told them that they didn't know him because he was from their town, but on the day of reckoning, on that glorious day, they will know who Babalola is and how great he is. At this statement, the whole church began to weep. It finally dawned on them that they had sinned against God and his servant, and they all began to confess their sins and to plead with him not to leave the town in anger. He forgave them and prayed for God to forgive his people. It was on 24th of July, 1959. That day they left Lofa for Efon Alaye, arriving by 7 p.m. 2 hours later, at 9:00 p.m., they left for Ibadan for the leadership meeting of CAC at Olugbode, which was held on Saturday, 25th of July. As soon as they finished, he made some personal visit to some persons to pray for them and to deliver God's message to them at home. One of these was S.A. Adeshina, who contested for the Alaye stool and had lost. Towards the evening of the 25th of July, he left Ibadan with his entourage towards Ede for the inauguration of the Good Women Maternity Home, which was to take place the next day, Sunday, 26th of July. On the way, they stopped at a village called Sakona, where they held evening prayer with the people. Usually, Babalola was never in a hurry when traveling. At every stop, prayers must be offered before proceeding. Thus, it was in the evening of Saturday by 7 p.m. when they reached CAC Talafia, Ede, where the host, Prophet Samson Akande, was eagerly awaiting them. Elaborate preparations have been made to receive him and his entourage, which included Medayes, Babajide, Odutola, etc. Supper was served immediately for these fathers, but Babalola did not taste of it. He was ushered into a room specifically prepared for him and was allowed to sleep, the only sleep he'd had in 12 days. Going to call Jesus. Early in the morning of Sunday, 26th of July, the apostle got up as early as 5 a.m. and requested for hot water. A coffee was prepared for him, but he insisted it must not have sugar or milk. That was how he drank it raw, the last thing he ever took before leaving the earth. It was a life of self-denial from beginning to end. After preparing for the service, he called for his deputy, the Assistant General Evangelist, Prophet David Babajide, and his host, Prophet S.O. Akande. He asked two of them to kneel and began to talk to them, rehearsing his experiences in ministry, from the beginning when he received the call to the present day and all the hassles he'd met in ministry. He reminded the duo that within the limit of human possibility, he had done his best. He now asked each of them to pray for him, that if there had been any sin Babalola had committed in the course of his ministry from the beginning to that day, that God should forgive him. Thereafter, he himself prayed the last prayer and made the benediction. He told the duo, "Now I thank God the way is clear." But they didn't understand. He encouraged them to be faithful, and thereafter he dismissed them. They went for the morning service, and he made the opening prayer. J.A. Medayese, the superintendent, gave the sermon at the service. Throughout the service, Babalola never stood up for once, not even when the congregation rose to sing hymns. He remained on his seat until at the end when he gave the benediction. After the service, the congregation moved straight to the dedication of the faith home, but Babalola went straight to his chambers to rest. After the dedication, delegates began to depart to their various destinations. Some of these also came to Babalola to bid him goodbye and to ask for his blessings and prayers, and he willingly obliged them. One of these was Pastor Adesona, the general superintendent of the church. As he was going, Babalola called him back and reminded him of the young man he had met at Ibadan few days before, who he promised to help with his wedding. This man had reached the age of marriage but had no father or any helper to see him through. Babalola then took it upon himself to give him the support he needed and reminded the general superintendent of the church to expedite action on the matter. This was his last act of mercy before he left for eternity. He was left to rest. At 3 p.m., his associates came for prayers with him. Medayese was the first to pray, followed by Odutola. Then just before Babajide could pick up the prayer, Babalola himself took it. and began to pray the very last prayer he made on the earth. And what was he praying about? According to Babajidi, he was praying for all people of the earth that their salvation may be sure, and not once did he make mention of his immediate family. He was allowed to rest while Medayas went for the evening service. One Michael Isajimi, one of the assistants with Babalola, stood at the entrance of his door. Around 4 p.m., the walls of the room where Babalola was began to shake as if experiencing a tremor or vibrations, but the cause of the movement could not be located. At 4:30 p.m. on the dot, Babalola breathed heavily 3 times. High, 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 as if to say God the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and like lightning the man was no more. It was exactly 40 days to the time he told his mother he would be going to call Jesus. The entire room shook, and yet the window panes did not break. Michael cried with a loud voice to summon the elderly men to come. As they opened Babalola's room, a wave of power hit them, and they all fell to the ground. By the time they rose up and moved near, they found he was lifeless. They began to pray while Babajid sent for Medayas, who was preaching at the evening service, to stop his sermon and close the service immediately and come. They all surrounded Babalola, each one holding a part of his body, and they began to pray from 5 p.m. till 7 p.m. Medayas began to plead in prayer, "Lord, what is our sin? What have we done wrong? Where have we missed it?" It was then a vision was shown to someone where he saw Babalola before the mighty gates of heaven, and entering through the gate he laid his sword at the feet of the Lord Jesus. The Lord then revealed to this servant that Babalola could not return to them again as they desired, because the heavens have already received him. At 7 p.m., Medayas declared plaintively, "The great apostle is gone. He was 55, still fit and agile, and without a single gray hair on his head." Thus marks the end of an era in Nigeria's religious and evangelical history. Arrangements were made, and the body was taken to Ifon that night. Even in death, his eyes were not closed, and there was a smile on his face. 8 days later, he was committed to Mother Earth amidst a flood of tears, wailings, and lamentations. All the schools in Lyesha and Ekiti were shut for the week as a mark of respect to the great apostle. Thus marks the end of an era.